Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to this month's webinar, and as scheduled we're going to be talking about achieving best evidence for social workers who work with vulnerable adults and children, and it'll be presented by Robin Watts, who is going to give an overview of the training that he provides to both social workers in different sectors. And it's a real pleasure to have you, Robin, doing this training for us. And you're welcome. You provide this up and down the country and also abroad, and I know you're going to go into much more detail about what you actually do in that, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Robin. Obviously a highly skilled child protection investigator and trainer. I've had the pleasure of working with Robin with some social workers recently, well actually the end of last year, on achieving best evidence, and it was for social workers who are children's social workers, but you also work with vulnerable adult workers. And your background, a career as a detective, working with child abuse investigation teams, expertise in training up and down the country and abroad. You have your website, you've achieved some acclamation in terms of the training that you provide that's accredited as well, and you have managed teams of investigators and trained those teams as well, and you have up-to-date information about good practice for people who undertake investigations of this matter. So over to you, Robin.
Lovely, thank you, Gradle, for that. Yes, just to move on a slide, I suppose, an introduction of me, and then I'm going to sort of introduce the course. It's a 5-day Achieving Best Evidence course, can be designed in 3 ways really. One, bespoke for children, so if people that work solely with children come on the course, it will be designed for them. Designed for people with vulnerable adults who work with vulnerable adults who may be interviewing children. It can be designed just for them, or we can mix it because the ultimate aims of an interview are the same. But of course there will be changing in the planning, the preparation and questioning, which we would do on a joint course if we had people working with both vulnerable adults and children. I think Gradle said a lot about me. As she said, I was a career detective, and I got forced against my will really to join the child protection unit back in the 90s. My main areas before that was, most of my years was as a murder squad detective. I was on drugs investigations and terrorism and things like that, and was seeing that that was the area to go, but I got sent to Lambeth as a child abuse investigator on a forced transfer to try and spread the experience of officers around the Metropolitan Police, and was an investigator in the Lambeth for about 5 years. And going back to ABE, before that it was what we used to call MOGP, the Memorandum of Good Practice, and we would video interview from there, and I probably did maybe 1 or 2 a week for 5 years of children for a range of issues that they'd had and abuse that they'd suffered. And then after the death of Victoria Climbié, the Metropolitan Police set up a training unit to train pan-London. All police officers and frontline social workers working with children and families would come to the courses, and I was asked to go and set up a training unit to train police and social workers on joint investigation and of course achieving best evidence and section 47, etc., etc. So I did that for another 5 years, and then decided I've got my over 30 years in, having joined in 1976, to retire around about 7-8 years ago, and since then I do a range of courses for social workers, police officers, and of course the educational sector and NHS, etc., on the child abuse remit, but concentrating on achieving best evidence. It's one of the areas that I think is extremely important and can in some ways do a tremendous amount of good for children, but also if done incorrectly, improperly, unplanned, can further harm children, leave them in a very vulnerable state as well. So I'm quite strict on my training, and I think I'm one of the few that insist that the training is a pass or fail course. It's a 5-day course. It's no way being a pass or fail course that I want anyone to become Jenson Button or Lewis Hamilton in the sort of driving. They don't want to be Formula One, but just to have the correct skills, know how to plan, prepare and question children, so that the children get the best result possible. I got fed up as a police officer, and then going on to sort of critique interviews, real interviews, how everyone would always blame the child for a bad interview, and I could see that that was perhaps never the case. It was always our fault because we didn't take considerations. I've got a bit of a noise in my ear, but so if I go to day one of this course, is what I try to cover is introductions of each other. Not all courses, everyone knows each other, and I have a bit of a fun around that as well. We introduce each other. I encourage the delegates to lie to each other about a fact in their life and not disclose the lie to them at all. But then when they introduce each other on the course, they say these facts about the person, one of them being a lie. And what I want to try to show there is how we lie and how we question and get through that. And I expect the delegates to use that as icebreaking to go and question people, to say if they've ever driven a Formula One car or they've jumped off of Mount Everest on a parachute, which one was the lie, and question them to see if that can be as an icebreaker. So that sort of introductions and questioning of each other is done. I then go into the history, of which I've sort of hinted at the Memorandum of Good Practice, where we were when I joined the police back in the 70s, how we used to interview children exactly the same as we interview adults, if you like. It would all be handwritten, etc. And then how it moved on after the Cleveland inquiry, and how we then became the Memorandum of Good Practice, and then how later it became Achieving Best Evidence. And Achieving Best Evidence is a term that I repeat during the course numerous times, especially when I'm asked questions, what about this, what about that, and I will say, well, what would achieve the best evidence, you know, on those scenarios that you give me. And then we talk about the eligibility for a forensic interview. So with children it can be a little bit easier to see about the eligibility, who can be interviewed, who can't be interviewed, when do we do an ABE interview, when don't we do an ABE interview. There is a feeling amongst a lot of professionals that any child, for example, that is abused and falls into the remit of social services, social care and police, etc., that they have to be video interviewed, and that's not ever been the case. It's what we decide with the child is the best way forward. So we go through all the eligibility, and then of course with vulnerable adults, where does that come in? The vulnerable adults, intimidating witnesses, etc. When can we use this system to interview vulnerable adults as well? And then I suppose the most important part of an ABE interview is talked about, which is the planning process. And I have found that every interview that has failed of a child, when we've looked at the planning process, the planning wasn't there. So to give some really basic examples, and I think most people would agree, would you interview a 15-year-old young person about an abusive situation that's gone on in their lives at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, or would you perhaps wait until the afternoon when they may be a little bit more alert, etc.? Would you interview a child that has some conditions where they have to have tea or lunch at a certain time, and say lunch is at 12, would you interview them at 11:45, because you're going to lose them on that kind of thing? You consider everything about them, and that is quite a long lesson, and we go through lots of all of our experiences of what would be good for individual children, and as long as you consider it, but also where will you get the information from to plan that process. I find one of our resources underused, and I think they feel underused as well, is that if it's the parent that is the abuser, I always think that the second biggest person in a child's life is their school and maybe their form teacher, their school teacher, a teacher at school. Do we go to them and say, how do you get the best out of this child when you're teaching them? How do you look at how they will listen and how they will react, etc.? Could you give us any help on how we should do that in that planning process? And then I finish the day on the feedback rules, because what I want all delegates to do is learn from each other, and I would absolutely have no qualms if at the end of the week they said to me that I actually learned more from the delegates than I did from you as a trainer. So, and what I want to do is encourage that. So when I go into the second day, which I'll do now, and we go into the interviewing, I get the delegates to practice just very short bits and pieces. They'll go away and, for example, practice introductions. How do we introduce ourselves? How do we introduce our child to this process? What do we say? What don't we say? How do we do that? And then afterwards, I want them, without me sitting in on this at that time, is to feedback. And I find a tremendous amount of delegates, a tremendous amount of social workers are absolutely lovely people. What they'll say is, oh, that was great, that was fantastic, and I really like the way you did that, but won't raise up that, well, actually, I wouldn't have done it that way, I may have done it this way, and you actually did say this when it was shown that we shouldn't have said that, etc. So giving a little bit of positive feedback, then giving a little bit of constructive feedback, and then hopefully ending up on a nice positive note for that person to take forward, and then learning off of each other. So when you do feedback, it forces delegates to listen to each other as well, so they can do a good feedback. We then go and practice ground rules, and there's quite a few ground rules that we have to put in place. So simple ground rule would be that some children at school get told off if they say "I don't know" to a teacher. Well, within the interview process, if they don't know an answer, then they should say "I don't know." And so explaining to the perhaps younger child that you're not going to get into trouble for saying "I don't know," and that yes, you can point out any misunderstandings, or if you don't understand the question that I ask, you can point that out. And more importantly in ground rules is understanding their concept of truth and lies, and that they understand the difference between a truth and a lie, with an element of deception within that truth and lie as well. So it's not good enough to say to a child, I'm wearing a pink jumper when it's clearly a blue jumper, because they're not deceiving anyone. So having the element of deception in the truth and lies. So we then sort of finish that up. So it's important that we tell the truth in this room, etc. And then we go, and that's all fed back as well. So then the delegates will do introductions and ground rules, feed that back. And then we go into free narrative and how to get free narrative. So you have a scenario of a child who has been hit with a stick across their back of their legs. Well, the last thing you want to do to the to encourage free narrative is say to the child, I understand your dad hit you with a stick last night, because that would then ruin the interview in the sense that that hasn't been introduced by the child already. So that's a leading question. And no question should ever be asked of a child that they haven't already brought up, because that would then be leading. And so we go in how to encourage free narrative from a child, etc. And then we go into questioning, the best way of questioning, the sort of the tried and tested way of asking questions of children. I find again that a lot of people close open questions without even knowing they're doing it. So for example, tell me what happened is a nice open question, but can you tell me what happened, or would you mind telling me what happened is a closed question. So encouraging that the questioning is kept as open as possible for as long as possible, etc. And then all the different styles of questioning we can use. So open, open specific, closed specific, questioning, forced choice questions, leading questions, multi questions, and nonsensical questions we go through as well. And then how do we close it? We've got the information. What do we do? Who do we speak to before we close? Do we go and speak to the controller, the co-interviewer? What do we do there, etc.? And that's all done hopefully by the end of day 2, which then leads us on to what a lot of people feel is a frightening day. It's getting more frightening, but this day 3 becomes frightening, because what I ask on day 3 is for each delegate to do at least one interview of a role player, so it'll be another delegate that will play the role of a child, and then that both people will be given, the interviewer and interviewee will be given a scenario, and the scenario will say what's happened, and the scenario will tell the role players playing the victim what's happened to them. And then they're interviewed using the whole system now, so the whole introductions, ground rules is all gone through, the free narrative, and then the questioning. They do the whole lot from start to finish. And then that is then fed back by us all. We all feed back on that, hopefully constructively, etc., how we feel that went. And the reason I use delegates on that one is to play the role play of the child, is because I like everyone to know what it feels like to sit in that seat and be interviewed. And so they can get the feeling of that and what the child in the future that they'll interview may be going through when they're doing that. So that can be pretty frightening, but at the end of it, I think a lot of people find that everyone they listen to, so if there's 8 delegates on a course, they will either have done one and heard 7 others. So that's like 8 lessons during that day. And a lot is taken away from that. And then the 4th day is where I get them to interview a victim of sexual abuse. And I use sexual abuse because it can be emotive, it can be sometimes embarrassing, it can be hard to ask the questions, because we have to get certain points to prove out on sexual abuse. So when we're talking about the abuse of rape, we have to prove to the jury that the penis entered the vagina, anus or mouth without the consent of that person. And we have to get that did happen, so they have to be asked the right questions to get that disclosure from the child. On this, though, I use a professional actor to do this. To try to get a delegate to do this role play would be extremely hard for the delegate to role play a child of sexual abuse. Use an actor that is so experienced in it that I think, excuse me, nearly every delegate said it was like interviewing a real person on this. And she will not trick you, not trap you or anything like that, will have in her mind what's happened, and if you ask the right questions, she'll give you the right answers. And then there's a multi-feedback after that. This one I am marking, so you will already have had sight of the marking sheet from the end of day 1, so you know what I'm looking for. Now, if I use the analogy of a driving test, there are majors and minors. So they are clearly marked in red, the majors. So if you do one of those, like you miss out truth and lies, or you ask a leading question at the start of an interview, we'd have to repeat that interview, and you'd have to learn from that and repeat that and hopefully not do that again, etc. And we go through all the marking criteria on that feedback, and then I privately tell you whether you passed or fail. I don't do it in front of everyone, just to keep the comfort levels there, I suppose. Normally, the vast majority pass on that quite easily. However, if we have some that struggled, or if somebody actually passed but felt that they would like to do another one, then on day 5 we'll do a further interview if needed. And then also what I'll go through on there is mopping up everything else. So the core process of a visually recorded interview. What is the core process? What happens with the whole tapes, the DVDs, etc., the recordings. I also go through inhibitors as well. So the difficult bits that I don't put into the beginning of the course. What would inhibit the investigation for the children? What would inhibit their disclosure, etc.? And I use a lot of research on that, on the psychology of a child who's been abused, etc. And then we have sort of questions and evaluations and closure, etc., going through day 5. So I think that in a nutshell is the 5-day Achieving Best Evidence course. Obviously, I'll take any questions after that. But one thing Gradle sort of has asked me to do off topic, I suppose, to the Achieving Best Evidence is just to say that at the moment child sexual exploitation is in the headlines. I even saw it in the headlines today. And we're offering also either a 1- or 2-day child sexual exploitation course, something that I was involved in as a professional, been involved in the multi-agency approach with that. And I've looked at a lot of cases and research around this as well. So we go through the victim's profile, offending profiles, trying to look at offenders and what they do, etc. The multi-agency approach, who does what, where, when and how. The lessons learned, so whatever lessons we have learned that from the past years. And then of course I go into the Sexual Offences Act and sexual abuse in children and all the reasons, causal, the signs, the symptoms, etc., the psychology of that with children. Why they allow themselves to do what they do, what's made them do that, etc. And also there'll be quite a lot more in that course as well. And what I'm trying to do with that course as well is try to do it more with a delegate approach as well, rather than a front-loaded course. I'm not a fan of standing up and talking on PowerPoint for hours. So it'll be, a lot of this will be done in sort of teamwork, in group work, etc. Gradle, is there anything you want me to add, clarify, change, say I didn't say?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, brilliant. Robin, I wanted to know, before I open questions to the larger audience and stop recording, firstly, how does the vulnerable adults achieving best interest differ in terms of preparation and questioning and support to vulnerable adults? How does that differ from the approach to children? And also in your course, how do you differentiate the judgment around what those workers would do? That was one question. And the second question, well, for you to give some more detail about is, I know that you provide a manual that workers have as well, so just some insights into what's within the manual and the certification process of your course and validation of it. And then lastly, and I'll come back to the child sexual exploitation, if you can give some examples, that would be really great. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'll try. You may have to remind me of some, but I'll
Sure.
try to start from the beginning. So I think we started off with vulnerable adults and how it differs from vulnerable adults. The core process of achieving best evidence of the video recorded interview is similar in its effect towards children and adults. So the actual interviewing process would be the same. So the same approach of open-ended questioning, the introductions of ground rules, the rapport, etc. Some things would be taken away. So we wouldn't be wanting to say to an adult, for example, if you don't know, then you don't have to say, and the truth and lie scenarios that we use would be changed completely. It would all meet the vulnerable adults' needs, and that's where I go back, I think, to probably slide 1, is the planning process. And a lot of the issues will be in the planning process if it's a vulnerable adult. So in some cases we would seek advice from our CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, whether we would have the Achieving Best Evidence model, or whether we would be taking a video recorded statement, or whether we'll take a statement from that person, etc. So we'll go through all the differences with that under the eligibility for forensic interview process. And then it's meeting the needs then of that adult and whatever needs they are. Their needs are so varied, I probably would struggle to go through a set criteria for each vulnerable adult here. but I use vulnerable adult scenarios. So it would be a vulnerable adult that will have some disability, some kind of issue there. We'd go through a scenario where there's been severe domestic violence with someone, so the intimidation would come out, etc., and go through that process. So that would change for the vulnerable adult sort of course. Did that sort of answer your question, Gradle, on that one? Yes, thanks. Second question, remind me, was just hoping that, great. Manual certificate, yeah, the manual is widely available. It's not my property. In fact, I think it's the Department of Health property, if I can remember rightly. It can be accessed online, or through the CPS website as well. It's a quite comprehensive manual, and you'll see if you flick through that, I've forgotten how many pages, it's over 100. The manual, we do send you the link there to get hold of the manual, so you can pre-read, you can sort of anticipate what you're going to be taught during the week. So that manual readily available. I would suggest you just type Achieving Best Evidence Manual in Google. You will get a link to that. Certification, CPD accredited certification at the end, and it will show that you passed. One thing alongside the certificate, a few people asked whether they would get the original marking sheet. The answer to that is no. Whoever is providing the training will keep the pass document, the pass-fail document, if you like, just as evidence if it's ever challenged in the future. But you can certainly have a copy. You can certainly have sight of it. There's nothing secret written in there whatsoever. In fact, I give them to each delegate after, and they can see what I've written anyway. And then if you want a copy, that could be scanned and sent. That's not an issue at all. And remind me the next one, please, Gradle. So, CSE, examples of investigations. I think you're asking what the investigations I've been involved in. Well, the investigations I was involved in was Lambeth-based child sexual exploitation, if I can say it. These were done back in, when did I join? So it would have been about 2000 to 2003, where there was quite a complex investigation. I'm trying to look because I've got, so yeah, it was before 2003 because I got an award for it actually. So back then I was just looking at my certificate. This was where children were exploited by a group of males within the Lambeth area, and we sort of brought them to justice then. So sort of bringing in that sort of history, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit more up to date. So I'm looking at and asking other officers, colleagues that I know how it's done now, how it's done in 2015 rather than back in 2002, I think it was when I did it, and the change of that. So bringing that, and it's another area on my BA was studying sexual abuse, etc., which incorporated a little bit of this as well. So bringing in some child sexual exploitation examples from my studies as well. I hope that answers everything for you, Gradle. Sorry if it doesn't.
No, it did. Thank you so much for that, Robin. And I'm actually going to stop recording now. People do have some questions, but before I stop recording, I just want to say that I joined you on the last training that you did with locum social workers, and part of that was on the last day when we looked at reflection in terms of the social workers considering what they'd learned over the 5 days and what they would be taking away with them to the context of their work situations, and looking at their development and their growth, which is a fundamental part of what you were doing with them anyway. but just putting it in the context of their continuing professional development and their HCPC registration and their portfolio, which is also another important part of the work that we do together, wasn't it, Robin? That was
yes, it was. Yeah, and that was actually very constructive, as I remember it. And they came out with a lot of things they hadn't actually said to me when you led that, and I was actually sitting there with a bit of a nice smile, to be honest, because what they were saying was very positive on how they were going to take that forward, and I hope they have, and I'm sure they have. They were, in fact, I know one or two have, because they've contacted me for a little bit of advice after the process, a few weeks. In fact, one was not long ago, and so they have certainly reflected on it, and that went down very well as well.
That's great. It was a good session, and we'll be doing more of that. And what we want to say is that as for locum social workers who are interested in doing the 5-day course, we're now going to run that, and we're going to show you the link to be able to join up for the course that Robin and I are going to run over the next few months throughout the year. So once we've finished this session, we'll send people the links to go to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to just, I'm going to stop recording now.